Birais defenders. In the relentless pursuit to conquer Birais, President Ruda of the Guerrillist Alliance devised a bold and methodical strategy to breach the heart of the nation's resistance, the capital city of Kasin. The first critical task fell to the Guerrillist military engineers, whose mission was as perilous as it was essential: to clear the roads leading to Kasin of the strategically placed mines and bombs that had turned every street into a potential death trap. The engineers knew that any misstep could mean instant death, not only for themselves, but also for the advancing army they sought to protect. The Guerrillist heavy artillery was deployed to provide cover for the engineers, suppressing Birais defenders and minimizing the threat to those risking their lives to neutralize the explosives. The artillery fire roared day and night, its deafening explosions shaking the earth and sending shockwaves through the city. Amidst this chaos, the engineers worked tirelessly, inching forward in small, careful increments as they defused one mine after another. It was grueling work, each moment fraught with danger, each successful defusal a small victory on the treacherous road to Kasin. For 2 long and agonizing months, the engineers continued their work. Progress was slow, and the cost in Guerrillist lives was steep. The roads leading to Kasin were littered with the remains of failed attempts, where a single wrong move had resulted in tragic explosions. But despite the heavy toll, the promise of victory and the strategic importance of securing Kasin drove President Ruda and his generals to press on. The engineers' efforts finally paid off when they cleared 30 kilometers of road, opening a crucial path for the Guerrillist infantry to advance into the capital. With this breakthrough, the Guerrillist army, bolstered by the hard-won progress, prepared to confront Birais' formidable first wave of resistance. President Ruda, ever the strategist, ordered the deployment of his 3-counter strategy, a systematic approach designed to neutralize Birais' defenses and secure control of the city. As the Guerrillist forces advanced, they encountered a level of resistance that surprised even the most battle-hardened soldiers. The civilians of Birais fought with unparalleled ferocity, hurling axes and swinging machetes with deadly accuracy. The streets of Kasin became a chaotic battleground, where the air was thick with the sounds of clashing metal, the screams of the wounded, and the relentless roar of gunfire. It was a scene of sheer brutality, as the civilians of Birais, despite being outmatched in terms of firepower, refused to back down. The Guerrillist soldiers, caught off guard by the ferocity of the civilian resistance, responded with overwhelming force. They unleashed a hail of bullets, their firearms cutting through the air with deadly precision. The streets ran red with blood as Birais civilians fell one by one, their sacrifices a testament to their unbreakable spirit and their willingness to defend their city to the last breath. As the battle raged on, it became clear that President Ruda's gamble in Birais had unleashed a brutal conflict. Both sides paid a heavy price and lives lost and casualties suffered. The civilians of Birais, though vastly outgunned, fought with a tenacity that shocked the Guerrillist forces, turning the streets of Kasin into a veritable crucible of war. The siege of Kasin had become a pivotal moment in the conflict between Birais and the Guerrillist Alliance, with the outcome of the battle poised to shape the course of history for both nations. President Ruda, observing the battle from his command center, understood that the fate of Kasin, and perhaps the entire war, hung in the balance. The capital's fall would signify not just a military victory, but a psychological blow that could break the spirit of Birais' resistance. However, he also recognized that the tenacity and courage of the Birais people made this victory far from certain. The battle for Kasin would test the limits of his strategy, the endurance of his troops, and the resolve of the Birais defenders in a clash that would echo through the annals of history. As night descended over the war-ravaged city, the battle raged on with no signs of slowing. Despite their advance, the Guerrillist forces encountered an enemy that refused to surrender. In the heart of Kasin, amidst the crumbling ruins of what was once a proud and vibrant city, the people of Birais braced themselves for the next phase of their desperate defense. They knew that the fight to reclaim their homeland was far from over. The dawn would bring yet another day of bloodshed, another day of relentless struggle, and another chapter in the epic siege of Kasin. Ruda's impasse. As the battle for Kasin raged on, President Ruda found himself in an increasingly precarious situation. The second wave of Birai's resistance had emerged from the city's fortified defenses with renewed vigor, sending hundreds of newly trained soldiers into the fray. The battlefield became a cacophony of gunfire, the air thick with smoke and the acrid scent of spent ammunition. Heavy artillery from both sides pounded the opposition, turning the landscape into a nightmarish tableau of devastation. The human toll mounted, with bodies strewn across the war-torn streets and the cries of the wounded echoing through the ruins. Despite the overwhelming force brought to bear by the guerrillist army, Birai's defenders were undeterred. The second wave had been met by the guerrillist anti-disintegration group, a force of 500 soldiers whose sole purpose was to prevent any breaches in the guerrillist defensive lines. They fought with grim determination, repelling the Birai soldiers with relentless precision. Yet, even as they held the line, it was clear that Birai's resolve had not been broken. As the dust settled from the initial clash, Birai's unleashed its third and final wave, the main force comprising professional soldiers armed with advanced weaponry. These were battle-hardened troops, the best that Birai's had to offer, and they charged into the fray with a ferocity that matched the intensity of the conflict. In response, President Ruda executed the final phase of his meticulously planned three-counter strategy. The anti-attack group, a united force combining the strength of all three counter units, was deployed to repel Birai's elite troops. The streets of Kasin became a deadly battleground, with both sides locked in a brutal struggle for supremacy. Guerrillist soldiers, emboldened by months of hard-fought victories and driven by their unwavering loyalty to Ruda, clashed with Birai's elite forces in a savage contest of wills. The fighting was intense, the losses on both sides staggering. Yet, despite the effectiveness of Ruda's countermeasures, the capital city remained out of reach. Frustration gnawed at Ruda as he reviewed the reports from the front lines. The battle for Kasin had devolved into a bloody stalemate. Every advance made by the guerrillist forces was met with fierce resistance, and every attempt to breach the city's defenses was thwarted by the determination of Birai's defenders. It was becoming increasingly clear that the fight for Kasin would not be won quickly or easily. In the war room of the guerrillist, Ruda convened a heated meeting with his top generals, seeking a breakthrough that would end the impasse. The room was charged with tension as the generals debated their next move, each proposing different strategies to break the deadlock. "We need to press harder," one general insisted, his fist slamming down on the table. "We have the numbers, the firepower. We can overwhelm them with a sustained assault." Ruda shook his head, frustration evident in his expression. "We've tried that approach, and it's only led to more casualties on both sides. We can't afford to throw away our soldiers in a fruitless assault. We need a new strategy." Another general, known for his cunning, suggested a different tactic. "What if we focus on cutting off their supply lines entirely? Starve them out. Without resources, they won't be able to maintain their defenses." Ruda considered this, but his brow furrowed with doubt. Birai's is resilient. They've already endured months of this siege. Even if we sever their supply lines, it could take months, maybe years, to see any significant impact. We need something faster. As the discussion continued, every suggestion met with a counterpoint, every plan with a flaw. The generals proposed everything from psychological warfare to guerrilla tactics, but Ruda could see the underlying truth: they were stuck. Birai's strategy of attrition was working. The guerrillist forces were being worn down, their morale eroding with each passing day of the stalemate. On the other side of the conflict, Birai's was also facing its own dire challenges. The prolonged siege had taken a devastating toll on the nation. Over 4 months of relentless warfare had left Birai's resources depleted, its infrastructure in ruins. Food production facilities had been destroyed, and supply lines were severed by the guerrillist alliance's coordinated attacks. More than half of Birai's army had perished, and the survivors were exhausted, their spirits battered by the unyielding onslaught. Despite the grim reality, General Blura and his remaining forces held firm. The people of Birai's continued to support their soldiers, rallying around their cause with an unwavering sense of patriotism. But the strain was beginning to show. Supplies were dwindling, and the once bustling streets of Kasin were now filled with makeshift barricades and hastily erected defenses. The city was under siege, and every day that passed brought them closer to the brink. As the stalemate in Kasin dragged on, both sides found themselves locked in a deadly embrace. President Ruda and General Bluro were engaged in a battle of wits, each trying to outmaneuver the other, each searching for a way to gain the upper hand. But for every move made, there was a counter, every advance met with resistance. Ruda, usually so confident in his strategies, now found himself facing an impasse he hadn't anticipated. The resources of the guerrillist alliance were vast, but even they were not infinite. The cost of the siege was mounting, and the prospect of a protracted conflict weighed heavily on Ruda's mind. He knew that if he didn't find a way to break the deadlock soon, the war could drag on for years, a scenario that neither side could afford. In the heart of Kasin, General Bluro was similarly burdened by the weight of the conflict. He knew that Birais couldn't hold out forever. The city was under constant bombardment, and every day brought new challenges. But he also knew that surrender was not an option. The people of Birais had placed their trust in him, and he was determined to see the fight through to the end, no matter the cost. As the sun set over the war-torn city, the battle for Kasin continued, both sides locked in a deadly struggle with no end in sight. The streets echoed with the sounds of gunfire and explosions, the air thick with smoke and the acrid stench of war. And as the night descended, President Ruda found himself facing the harsh reality that victory in Birais would not come easily. The impasse held, and the fate of both nations hung in the balance, waiting for the next move in this deadly game of strategy and survival. A new solution in sight. In the dimly lit chamber of the presidential quarters, President Ruda stood amidst the weight of the war with Birais. The protracted conflict, once thought to be a swift and decisive conquest, had devolved into a grueling stalemate. The fortified defenses of Kasin had proven impenetrable, and despite the guerrillist army's formidable strength and strategic prowess, the siege showed no signs of abating. Ruda paced back and forth, his mind a storm of strategies, each one faltering in the face of Birais' resilience. The frustration that gnawed at him was palpable, a gnashing beast that threatened to consume his confidence. The dream of a quick victory had faded, replaced by the grim reality of a drawn-out war. The silence of the room, thick with the weight of Ruda's thoughts, was abruptly shattered as a soldier burst in, breath ragged and eyes wide with urgency. "President Ruda," he gasped, his voice laced with the importance of the message he bore, "there's a scientist from Guerrillist here. He claims to have a crucial solution to our current predicament." Ruda's interest was piqued. Amid the despair and frustration that had settled over him like a suffocating fog, the prospect of a potential breakthrough sparked a glimmer of hope. "Bring him to me at once," Ruda commanded, his tone sharp with anticipation. Moments later, the doors swung open, and a man was ushered in. The scientist's appearance was a stark contrast to the military austerity surrounding him. Clad in a crisp lab coat and sporting thick glasses that magnified his intense, thoughtful eyes, he exuded an aura of intellectualism and purpose. He greeted President Ruda with a respectful nod, his demeanor calm yet tinged with the urgency of the situation. "President Ruda," the scientist began, his voice measured and tinged with reverence, "it is an honor to be in your presence. I have come to offer my assistance in finding a solution to the current impasse we face." Ruda scrutinized the man before him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. While the prospect of a solution was tantalizing, he remained wary. Too many had offered promises only to deliver disappointment. Still, something in the scientist's demeanor suggested that this man was different. "Please, proceed," Ruda urged, his voice steady but expectant. He gestured for the scientist to share his proposal, hoping that this might be the breakthrough they desperately needed. The scientist took a deep breath, his mind racing to organize his thoughts into a coherent presentation. "Mr. President," he began, "I have been studying the intricacies of urban warfare and the specific challenges posed by Birais' fortified defenses. It's clear that a direct assault on Kasin would only result in further casualties, draining our resources and prolonging the conflict indefinitely." Ruda nodded, his expression grave but attentive. "Indeed," he acknowledged, We cannot afford to continue down a path that leads to endless bloodshed and suffering. What solution do you propose, then? The Rabbit's Gambit. Ruda's initial skepticism began to melt away, giving way to cautious optimism as he listened intently to the scientist's unexpected proposal. The man before him was no ordinary researcher. His mind was a labyrinth of innovation, weaving connections that others might overlook. As he explained his plan, Ruda found himself drawn deeper into the intrigue. The scientist began with a curious introduction to a species known as the Ester rabbits, native to the western forests of Leopardia. These rabbits, he explained, had thrived to the point of becoming a nuisance, their population explosion turning them into both a pest and a prized source of meat for the region. The meat of the Ester rabbits had become a delicacy, feeding not only the people of Leopardia but also crossing borders to reach Birais, where it was highly valued. Intriguing, Ruda remarked, his interest fully piqued, though he was unsure where this line of thought was leading. But what does this have to do with our current situation? The scientist's eyes gleamed with excitement as he unveiled the crux of his strategy, a masterstroke that combined biology with warfare. He proposed the use of a chemical compound called estroxin, a substance that, when introduced into the Ester rabbits, would trigger a reaction within their bodies, causing them to produce a secondary compound known as primixtics. This is where it gets interesting, the scientist continued, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and caution. Primixtics, when consumed, is completely harmless to the populations of Gorillist, Leoniais, Tagera, Hyaenia, Leopardia, and Wolfia. However, in Birai citizens, it triggers a devastating reaction. The compound acts as a cholera-like toxin, leading to severe gastrointestinal distress, dehydration, and in many cases, death. Ruda's eyes widened as the implications of the scientist's proposal became clear. This was no ordinary tactic of war, it was a silent, insidious means of undermining Birai's resistance from within. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its covert nature. It would infiltrate Birai's food supply, turning their sustenance into a weapon against them without the need for direct military confrontation. You mean to say, Ruda began slowly, piecing together the details, that by injecting estroxin into these rabbits, we can introduce this primixtics toxin into Birai's food supply? Precisely, the scientist confirmed with a nod, his excitement barely contained. The Ester rabbits, carrying the concealed primixtics, will enter Birai's food chain undetected. As the people consume the meat, the toxin will spread, weakening their population, sowing chaos, and effectively crippling their ability to resist. Ruda's mind raced as he considered the potential of this plan. It was a form of unconventional warfare, one that could bring Birais to its knees without further exhausting the Gorillist army or engaging in a prolonged siege of Kasin. It spared Gorillist soldiers from more bloodshed while striking at the very heart of Birais' resilience and morale. This is ingenious, Ruda finally said, a slow smile spreading across his face. A strategy that attacks not just the body but the spirit of our enemy. We can destabilize Birais from within, making them easier to conquer with minimal additional loss of life on our side. The scientist beamed, clearly pleased that his proposal had found favor with Ruda. Indeed, Mr. President. The best part is that this can be done with relative ease. The Ester rabbits are already a part of Birais' diet. All that is required is to introduce the estroxin into their population, and the rest will follow naturally. Ruda leaned back in his chair, his mind already plotting the logistics of this new strategy. The plan had the potential to turn the tide in Gorillist's favor without the drawn-out conflict that had drained both resources and morale. But there was still more to consider. As the scientist turned to leave, Ruda stopped him with a question. You hinted that the good part of the story was yet to be told. What else is there? The silent tides of war. As the scientist elaborated on the intricate details of his plan, President Ruda leaned forward, absorbing every word with keen attention. The weight of the protracted war with Birais had pressed heavily on his shoulders for months, but now, in the dim light of his private chamber, a glimmer of hope began to flicker amidst the darkness. The brilliance of this approach lies in the slow onset of the poisoning, the scientist explained, his voice carrying an undercurrent of excitement that belied the gravity of their discussion. It takes approximately 15 to 16 days for the active ingredient, primixtics, to fully take effect. During this period, Birai's soldiers will likely conduct small-scale tests on the meat, finding no immediate harm and thus trusting it as a food source. By the time the toxin's effects become apparent, exhaustion, dehydration, continuous diarrhea, it will be too late. Ruda nodded, his mind racing as he envisioned the implications. The slow nature of the poisoning ensured that Birai's forces would not suspect foul play until the toxin had spread throughout their ranks. It was a masterstroke of psychological and biological warfare, subtle, insidious, and devastating. And how do these Esther rabbits find their way to the tables of Birai's soldiers? Ruda inquired, his voice steady, masking the anticipation he felt. The success of this plan hinged on flawless execution, and he needed to understand every detail. That, Mr. President, is at your discretion, the scientist replied. I've already brought over 1,000 Esther rabbits injected with estroxin. I recommend ordering thousands more to expedite the process. Once injected, the rabbits will produce primixtics within 3 days. From there, it's simply a matter of ensuring they reach the enemy's food supply. A moment of silence fell between them as Ruda contemplated the enormity of what they were about to undertake. This was not just another battle tactic, it was a turning point in the war. The brilliance of the scientist's plan was in its simplicity and its terrifying effectiveness. Victory, which had seemed distant and elusive, now appeared within reach. Your timing is impeccable, Ruda finally said, his voice thick with emotion. This plan, your plan, has given us a path to victory that we desperately needed. The fate of our nation, the survival of our people, hinges on its success. We must ensure that every step is executed flawlessly. The scientist inclined his head in acknowledgement, his own heart swelling with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He knew the risks involved, but he also recognized the potential for a decisive end to the conflict. Ruda wasted no time. With renewed determination, he began organizing the deployment of the Esther rabbits. Trusted operatives were briefed in secret, their tasks outlined with precision. The rabbits would be transported under the guise of trade, introduced into Birai's food supply through carefully selected channels. Every detail was scrutinized, every contingency planned for. The coming days would be crucial. If the plan succeeded, the guerrillist army would achieve what months of relentless warfare had failed to secure, a swift and decisive end to Birai's resistance. If it failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. As the final arrangements were made, Ruda allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The war had taken a toll on him, both physically and mentally. He had seen too much bloodshed, too many lives lost. This plan, as ruthless as it was, offered a way to end the conflict with minimal further casualties on his side. It was a dark path, but in war, morality was often the first casualty. Thank you, my friend, Ruda said, his voice sincere as he turned to the scientist. Your brilliance has given us hope in our darkest hour. Now, let us ensure that this plan is executed with the precision it demands. The future of our nations depends on it. The scientist nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. I will oversee every detail personally, Mr. President. You have my word. With the plan set in motion, Ruda knew that the next few weeks would be a test of patience and resolve. The silent tide of war had shifted, and soon, Birai's would face a threat from within, one they could neither see nor stop. Victory was within reach, but the war was far from over. Every decision, every move from this point forward, would determine the outcome. And as Ruda stared out into the night, he knew that the fate of two nations rested on the edge of a knife, one guided by his hand and the other by the unseen force of the primixtics toxin. The war had entered its final phase, and with it, a new kind of battle would be waged, one of silence, shadows, and subtlety, where the true victor would be the one who could master the art of the unseen.
We're driving me.